that believes in individual rights over corporate and government rights? Is this the crowd that believes we should elect someone in November that will cut $1 trillion from the federal budget in the first year and balance the budget in 3 years? So is this the crowd that believes in principles over politics? Is this the crowd that believes that Congress should honor their oath to support and defend the Constitution? Ron Paul revolution, give us back our Constitution! Ron Paul revolution, give us back our Constitution! Ron Paul revolution, give us back our Constitution! So I think I'm in the right place. So I have a couple things I need to tell you. This is the winds of change, somebody says. We need room for Dr. Paul to speak back here. So. All right, the Kansas Caucuses are tomorrow. So do you think you're going to make it? This is the size of crowd we need for the caucus here in this county tomorrow. So we can take this county for Dr. Ron Paul. Now here's the thing. The caucus is from 10 to 1. You need to be there the whole time. The doors open at 8:30. What time do you need to be there? At 8:30. That's right, 8 o'clock. Are we okay to move on? All right, one more time. Is this the crowd that believes liberty transcends all party labels and therefore Ron Paul can beat Obama in November? Remember the caucus tomorrow because it's about the delegates. Let me introduce a young man that has worked tirelessly on the Ron Paul campaign. He is the leader for the Youth for Ron Paul 2012 chapter at the University of Kansas. Give it up for Mr. David Conway.
Coming out and supporting the revolution. My name's David Conway. I grew up here in Lawrence, Kansas. I'm an Army veteran. I served 2 tours in Iraq, and I'm currently a philosophy. I'm currently a philosophy student here at KU. Dr. Paul is a humble man. He doesn't like to brag. So I just want to take the few next moments to brag about Dr. Paul and talk about some interesting facts you wouldn't normally hear in his speech. So he was a captain in the U.S. Air Force, and he served as a flight surgeon. Dr. Paul is an OBGYN that has delivered over 4,000 babies. Instead of accepting Medicaid and Medicare payments for his poor patient, Dr. Paul lowered his fees or offered services for free. He's been married to his high school sweetheart for over 55 years. Ron Paul is the only congressman to hit a home run in the congressional baseball game. He has never voted for an unbalanced budget. He has never voted to raise congressional pay. He has never voted for a government-paid vacation. He has never voted to increase the power of the executive branch. And he voted against the Patriot Act. He also voted against the NDA. He does not participate in lucrative congressional pension programs. He returns a portion of his annual congressional office budget to the U.S. Treasury every year. And Dr. Paul chocolate chip cookies. As a veteran, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. He has also taken that oath, and he has a consistent record of following it. Ron Paul is my personal hero for that. But the cause of liberty doesn't stop with Dr. Paul. It continues with you and me and the people of KU. And I promise you here today that I dedicate my life to promoting the causes of peace, liberty, and the Constitution. Now let's give it up to the man, the defender of the Constitution, Dr. Ron Paul.
And staying up. Let's have the mic stay up too. Necessary. I'm going to have to hold the mic. How's that? I'll have to speak softly. Carry a big stick. I think that's going to work. And thank you very much for coming on. David, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. And I want to tell you, David and Tabitha really worked very hard, and I am delighted with the turnout. This is very exciting. Also, I'd like to introduce a few members of my family that's with me tonight. My wife, I've been married to her for 55 years. And we have two grandchildren of our 18, Lisa and Linda. I do know how much work David and Tabitha put into this, so I know these things don't happen accidentally, and we probably gave them 3 or 4 days notice or something like that, so this is really pretty amazing. And I heard there was a little bit of competition on campus, but I appreciate very much that you come here tonight. But I'm here to talk about a favorite subject. It's not complex. It's simple. It's one word. We're talking about liberty. I don't think we have enough of it. I think we've lost too much of it. It was given to us by our Creator. The Constitution was supposed to guarantee it. We did pretty well. But the last 100 years, I say it's been slipping away, in the last 50 years especially so. So there is a need for the revival of our intellectual revolution that will defend the cause of liberty. I just met David a few minutes ago, and I was very impressed that he is a veteran, and he spent 2 tours of in Iraq, in the military. And it does remind me of the importance of our military, of course, That is one of the major functions of the federal government, is to provide a strong national defense. And that does not mean that we're supposed to be the policemen of the world, nor do we have to get involved. We shouldn't be involved in nation building and getting involved in internal affairs of all nations, which the founders did not give us the authority to and advised us strongly not to. Now, David has spent enough time in Iraq to understand it. It was one of the most important issues for him to come home and decide that he would support our candidacy, because it was so important to concentrate on foreign policy and change the nature of foreign policy to that of intervention, to that of national defense. Very simply, obey the Constitution. That would be a pretty good place to start. The Constitution is very clear about who should declare war. It's not the president. It was never meant that the king, we didn't like the king declaring war, and the executive branch was not given the authority to declare war. The war power was given to the Congress, to the people, and if our country needed to go to war, it was supposed to be only with a declaration of war, with the intention that you fight, you win, you defend your country, and then you come home. Which raises a lot of question about what we've been doing in the last 10 years. And as a consequence of 9/11, certain things have been done in the last 10 to 12 years that wouldn't have been done otherwise. And for instance, if 9/11 had not occurred, we wouldn't have the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was planned for before 9/11. 9/11 provided the opportunity to get a piece of legislation passed that they wanted. Now, if that bill had been called Repeal the Fourth Amendment, maybe it would have never been passed, but that's essentially what it does. And then when you think about what they do to us at airports, and they get this authority from the Patriot Act, once we repeal the Patriot Act, just think, the TSA will lose a lot of their authority to pod and probe and x-ray us at airports. There is so much that we have drifted away from in this country. We were once the most free country and the most prosperous country. It's not that way anymore. Other countries are much richer. We're the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world, and our middle class is shrinking. The wealth of this country is shrinking. We still have material wealth in this country, but it's all based on debt. And most people realize it's coming to an end. Most people realize it's not a fair distribution any longer. Where a free society gives you the largest middle class, our middle class is shrinking, and our middle class is getting poorer. The poor are getting poorer, and guess what? What is happening? A lot of wealth is being transferred to the privileged class. And that is the reason we have to address this, because this will cause social dissension, and right now it already has, because under these conditions, especially when you destroy a currency, you always have transfer of wealth from the middle class and the poor to the wealthy class. And then when they get the benefits from a system like that and they get into trouble, guess what they do? What they did in 07 and 08. Come crying to the people. We're too big to fail. Don't let us fail. It'll be a calamity if we fail, so we need bailed out. So the Congress rushed in, the Fed rushed in, they bailed them out and bought up all the bad debt. The debt should have been liquidated, there should have been bankruptcies, but they bought the debt out, the government bought the debt, the Fed bailed it out, dumped it on the American people. And guess what? The American people lost their jobs and they're losing their houses. This is the reason that we have to reassess this whole process, especially the monetary system, as well as the destruction of our currency and the wasteful spending and the deficits. We've got to get control of the spending in Washington, D.C. That is the reason, of course, our program is to cut $1 trillion the first year in office. Some will argue, isn't that what the Congress is doing? Isn't that what doing? They're cutting spending. They talk about it, but there's no effort to cut spending. Nobody thinks it's serious enough to cut spending. All they're talking about is cutting the proposed increases. They work on the idea that there is a proposed increase. Baseline budgeting means the budget deficit and spending will go up steadily over the next 10 years. In the next 10 years, the plan is to spend $10 trillion of more money. So when they talk about cutting, and this automatic cut that came out of the Congress failing to have a budget, and then the super committee making a super mess of things, then they come up and they say, we're going to cut over $1 trillion over 10 years of the $10 trillion of the proposed increases, and they think you're supposed to believe that. You know, and there are no cuts. So if you cut $1 trillion over 10 years, you're cutting $100 billion. That used to be a lot of money, but nowadays they don't think that's very much. Pretty soon they're going to be talking about quadrillions rather than just trillions. But that won't add to much, because literally our national debt is going up $100 billion every month. And $100 billion every month is average. But this February broke all records. Just the February went up, the debt went up $200 billion in 1 month. It is very clear, common sense tells us it's unsustainable, it's damaging, because the principle is that if there's money to be spent, you don't want the politicians and you don't want the bureaucrats spending the money, we want the people to spend the money. I've had a few years in Washington off and on. It wasn't there straight through 30 years, but I tell you what, I've met a lot of politicians and I've met a lot of bureaucrats. And I can guarantee you one thing, they're not smart enough to know how to spend your money. You should spend your own money, not the politicians. Reason when people tell you cutting $1 trillion would be harmful to the economy, just tell them it would be much better, because when the government spends $1 trillion, they take the money from the people. That's pain, and that's a loss. But then when the government spends it, then they spend it on more laws, that's another loss. So you lose twice on it. This very year, on January 1st of this year, 40,000 new laws were put on the books. So I'm looking forward to the day that if you are to see that I am elected, I want to make sure I would like to have a year where we get rid of 40,000 laws. We don't have a shortage of laws. We have too many laws, obviously. Which means, though, in order to do this, we have to decide once again what the role of government ought to be. The founders did that. They gave us a constitution. Of course, we have drifted from that. But we need to ask that question, and quite frankly, the Constitution is not complex. It just says it's to protect liberty, it's to protect our freedoms, have a strong national defense, but it's to give us a sound currency. But it's not to run the world, it's not to run an entitlement system, and it's not to run up deficit. And it certainly didn't give the Federal Reserve authority to print money at all. That argument about the central bank and creating new money out of thin air occurred at the Constitutional Convention, and it was an argument between the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians, and the argument, it continues to go on. The Hamiltonians won, and they gave us a national bank, and Jefferson got rid of the first one, and Andrew Jackson got rid of the second national bank. But we're waiting for the day when we can get rid of the third national bank. be an opportune time for that because the Federal Reserve will be 100 years old. They came into existence in 1913. They've destroyed about 97–98% of the value of the dollar they inherited in 1913. So I think we'll celebrate next year by repealing the Federal Reserve Act that's beginning. This issue very clearly. They had had runaway inflation with the continental dollar, so they wanted to prevent the agony of currency destruction. So they said, only gold and silver can be legal tender, no authority for a central bank, and you cannot print paper money. And look at what we have today. They thought it was going to work, and for a while it did, because we were so rich, we were issuing the reserve currency of the world, our credit was good, but it's all coming to an end right now. And it especially has been made worse in the last 40 years, since 1971. Because up until 1971, although we weren't on a gold standard, there was a loose link to gold. There were some restraints on the creation of new money. But since 1971, we have been building this horrendous worldwide financial bubble, which we are seeing now coming unglued. And this is what these last 5 years are all about. This is what the chaos in Europe is all about. And our Federal Reserve and our Treasury has indicated that the American people, because we still have some credibility with our dollar, we will bail out Europe. But I can guarantee you it'll destroy the dollar. It'll destroy our economy and make it much worse for us. So no bailouts of Wall Street, no bailouts of European Wall Street either. But the real sinister part of a central bank is that you can hide the effects. It is a tax. When you print money and value the currency, it is a tax. But it's so unfairly levied on the middle class. The wealthy don't care how much gasoline prices are. You know, if you're making millions on Wall Street, if gasoline's $4 or $5, what do they care? But what if you're in the middle class? What if you're poor? What if you're struggling? What if you want to pay your own bills? And gasoline goes from $3 to $5. It can wipe a company out or a family. It can be very, very harmful. So this is the reason that inflation is so damaging, because the tax falls on the middle class, and the people who get to spend the money first have all the benefits. Who gets to spend the money first? First it's the government, then it's the military-industrial complex, then it's the banking system, anybody who has a contract with the government. So therefore it's very unfair, it's immoral, it's bad for the economy, and worst of all, it encourages the growth of big government. It should stop. Yeah. Jefferson argued the case for no borrowing. He lost that argument, and it would have been a good idea that we couldn't even have borrowed. But even the borrowing, we're going way beyond that. There's a limit to taxation because, the people would resist it. And then we started borrowing. There's a limit to that. Our interest rates go up. And that's why they had to create the system of just creating money out of thin air. So what we need to do, though, is eliminate this ability to finance deceitfully big government, because that encourages the growth of the entitlement system and also the warfare system. And while doing this, they think they can get away with it by delaying the payment, but eventually the payment comes due. It used to be said that we would say, we can't keep spending like this. We're going to pass this debt on to the next generation. There's so many of the young people here. You know what? It isn't the next generation. It's this generation. It's us today, and that's why we have to do something now. The entitlement system was introduced when we were still a very, very wealthy nation. We were a creditor nation. Today we're a debtor nation, the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world. But we introduced this notion that, yes, we have to have the entitlement system, because if government doesn't take care of those who are needy, nobody will. But what they didn't realize and didn't understand, and now we're coming to the realization that once the government embarks on taking care of those who are less well off than others, yes, they will create equality. They create equality of poverty, and that's why we cannot depend on the government to produce wealth or distribute it fairly. They can't do it. It's always done through special interests if it's done that way, and that's why you have to challenge the entitlement system. Entitlement sounds like a right. Oh, I'm entitled to this, I want this, I demand this, I have a right to this. But nobody is entitled to somebody else's wealth. Nobody's entitled to it. Now, if the entitlement system actually created wealth and had a fair distribution and we would all be better off, it'd be a little tougher. I'd still argue the moral case against government force. But it isn't the case. They don't make us better off. They make us worse off. They're the ones who create these problems of malinvestment and deficits and all the problems we face. But you know, I was thinking one time, and I introduced legislation along this way to get the American people to understand how much this is really costing. Let's assume for a minute that you couldn't inflate the debt, you couldn't monetize debt, and let's say we couldn't borrow money, and then we had to pay our bills as we went along. What about, under those conditions, make sure that there's no withholding tax, that your businessman, your boss, doesn't withhold your tax and becomes the tax collector, and just say that every one of us, to pay for the war and pay for the entitlements, every month we send a check to the government. I believe it would end rather quickly. People would be so furious about that. They would argue the case, these wars aren't worth it. What are we doing over there? How many years does it take for us to wake up? I say, if we had, I would say by now, after 10 years, we ought to wake up. It's time to come home and bring our troops home from the Middle East. We don't need any more war. One way, of course, if we wouldn't go to war unless war was declared, there'd be a lot less war. We wouldn't have had one since World War II. Just think of the wealth of this country. You know, we don't go to war in a proper manner. And this week it was a rather startling event in the Senate when Panetta was before the Senate, and he said, well, we get our authority from international organizations like the UN and NATO. Now, Senator Sessions challenged him. Thank goodness he was there to do that. It isn't a brand new idea. We've been doing this for a long time, but the American people and the members of Congress are getting a little bit annoyed with this, and so he was challenged, and this is, where do you get this authority? And they indicated, well, you know, from the UN and NATO, but we will inform the Congress on what we're doing. Well, thanks a lot. This idea of informing Congress, which is informing the people through their congressmen should make the decision to go to war, not the king, not the president. I can promise you, if I could be your president, I will not be fighting undeclared wars all around the world. The wars that we have fought these past year have added $10 trillion to our national debt. So they're not cheap and they're ongoing. Just think of the expense that is long term, the taking care of our veterans. So often they don't get taken care of very well. Sometimes they have a hard time getting the medical care that they need. But this is a very, very expensive. I've argued the case. I even said this in the debate a week or two ago, and I said, listen to the other candidates. You might not accept my moral argument. You might not. But there's a lot more going on than just the wars, the war atmosphere that has happened in this country, whether it's passing the Patriot Act or an ongoing war that we have had for essentially in modern times since in the early 1970s, has been this war on drugs. Not a good war at all. trillion have been spent. I don't think it's done a bit of good. It's been very expensive, and it has been a tremendous underminer of our civil liberties. This is the reason so many people now, with the use of the Patriot Act, that they can bust into houses without proper search warrants. And did you know that every once in a while they go into the wrong houses and kill people by looking for drugs? So it is something that we should challenge. I personally have a strong abhorrence of drugs, but I also know from being in medicine and in politics that prescription drugs are our biggest problem with addiction. And I'm also convinced that alcohol is a much more deadly drug, as well as nicotine, than is marijuana. I still urge everybody to be cautious, taught my children not to use drugs, and make sure everybody that it isn't the use of drugs. What we should be arguing for is personal choice. You making up your own mind what you want to